All right, everyone, welcome back to a new episode of Transforming Social Justice. My name is Megan Fuciarelli, the founder and Chief Empowerment Officer of US Squared. And today we're going to be talking about sanism. Now, sanism is an interesting concept. It's one that many of us have probably heard of the concept, but maybe not the definition. We're also going to talk about how this form of discrimination impacts organizations, both in the business world and in the educational space. And like always, I have Justin, our programming coordinator, with me to support the conversation. And I'm super excited to have you, Justin. Let's kick off the conversation here.
Hi everyone, it's Justin again as Megan shared. I'm the programming coordinator for US Squared and I'm very excited to be part of this conversation today.
Awesome. So I'm excited to jump into it. As I already kind of alluded to, we're going to be talking about sanism this month. Now, Justin, how do we define sanism within us squared?
Yeah. So here at US Squared, we define cynicism as discrimination, prejudice, or stereotyping based on someone's either perceived or actual mental health. But Megan, I'm curious. So how does mental health intersect with our DI efforts within the educational sector and the business environment?
Yeah, we've identified 15 different identities that we talk about within us squared, and mental health is one of those. They are deeply intertwined with what we do here at us squared, which is really dominant in social justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And in both mental health and the DEI or JEDI space, individuals from underrepresented groups are often facing unique stressors and barriers that can impact their well being. And when we talk about sanism, we're specifically talking about mental or psychological well being, emotional well being. And we want to make sure that this is just as important as the physical well being because discrimination, microaggressions, these feelings of exclusion or othering can take a toll on one's mental health.
And what are some of the common challenges faced by students, educators, employees in these settings?
I mean, honestly, these mental health challenges are faced by everyone who struggles with mental health. There's not specific pieces that only students struggle with or only educators struggle with, but really as a whole, they can grapple with a range of issues. Some of them include things like imposter syndrome. I know myself, I have struggled and I still struggle with imposter syndrome from time to time. Burnout, especially within my generation, it's almost like a badge of honor to work lots of hours. And that can lead to burnout. And our mental health can really take a toll on that because sometimes we'll tell ourselves that we have to work that many hours or we have to do so much or we're not good enough unless we do this, this, and this. And that can also lead to that heightened pressure to perform well. We genuinely believe that everyone wants to do the very best they can, but sometimes, especially for someone struggling with mental health, that can impact so many components of who they are on a daily basis. It can lead to even more significant mental health issues like anxiety and depression. Now, we differentiate between anxiety and depression from just being nervous and being sad, right? Anxiety is a chronic issue. Nervousness is you're experiencing a one time event, or we all get nervous from time to time, but anxiety is a clinical diagnosis. And then depression is a clinical diagnosis. It is very different from simply being sad or discouraged at a moment. And that stigma surrounding those clinical diagnoses with mental health, specifically anxiety and depression, can discourage individuals from seeking help. And I reflect a lot in my experience as an educator that mental health was a huge conversation that we had, especially when working with our students who were struggling with mental health and then going to their parents and trying to have those conversations. I know for myself personally, mental health has a huge stigma from my upbringing. It was very difficult to address and talk about. And when I was in the school system, we found that same thing to be true. We would see students struggling with mental health issues, and we would have conversations with their parents or with other teachers to try and help support them and provide them resources to be able to manage their mental health in a more productive way. And oftentimes we saw parents or even some staff members who had such a stigma attached to mental health that it was difficult to have that conversation. We saw this specifically within certain identities as well. In society, there are certain identities who really stigmatize the idea of mental health supports more than others. And I just remember, as an educator, as a leader, having those conversations with parents could sometimes be difficult because, as parents, of course, we want our children to be happy, productive members of society. And when someone tells us that our child isn't happy, we will sometimes place that on ourselves rather than acknowledging that it's a clinical diagnosis, just like diabetes or a heart problem. Anything that's physically going on in our body is the same thing as a mental health diagnosis. It's physically going on in our body, and it's not meant to have shame or blame attached to it. But that's something, that stigma around mental health is something we saw a lot, especially in the education system.
Stigma is definitely one of the biggest factors that contribute to sanism that I've also seen in a lot of the environments I've been in as a student, as an employee. And I think to a fault, like society has made some of mental health conditions taboo that also contribute to that. But it's not just personal or individual circumstances that can cause these issues or this mental health distress, right?
No, absolutely not. We've talked so far about quite a few individual pieces, right? An individual struggling with mental health. But we can also, as a society, be in the midst of a certain situation that will cause almost a pandemic of mental health concerns. And we saw this with another pandemic, which was COVID-19. We are almost 5 years out now. COVID-19 was really out in the fall, the later fall of 2019, but it really became a global pandemic in early 2020. So we're recording this podcast in May of 2024. So we're almost 5 years out, 4.5 years out. But that pandemic had a profound impact on mental health. And it was not an individual struggled with depression or anxiety. It was an entire society, because of outside influences, struggling with that. There were so many different components that played into mental health. There was a sudden shift of going to remote work for many people who had the opportunity to work remotely. There were also other positions, jobs, places that did not allow for remote work. They were called frontline workers, and that was not available. So if you struggled with any kind of physical health issues, you were told to avoid contact with people, but depending on your job, you didn't have that luxury sometimes. And then for the people who had to go to work and they had children, our children across the globe were learning from home. And that included a whole other realm of concerns and mental health. Not only the anxiety of getting sick, the worry of, oh my gosh,
Mm-hmm.
am I going to get sick? We
Yeah.
saw an increase in not just depression and anxiety there, but we also saw an increase in the fear and the social anxiety. Social anxiety is something that we've known has existed in society for decades. However, we saw an extreme uptick of social anxiety because people were not engaging with anyone outside of their homes
Yeah.
for over a year, right? I remember myself, I can get along with people, right? Like I'm kind of a people person, but I will tell you that during the pandemic, I was home all the time because of my lupus, which I know I've shared with our audience. I have lupus, and with any kind of immunity disease, you have to be really mindful of staying safe, especially during the pandemic. And I remember having to go out into public after, and I waited at least 2.5, maybe even 3 years before I went out in public again. Other than going to the grocery store with a mask on and gloves. I mean, I was the person who, with gloves and a mask, And I didn't even go to the grocery store for the first like month, or actually probably first 6 months. I didn't even go to the grocery store. I mean, it was horrible. But I remember when I started going back out into public and talking to our clients, even virtually, I realized that our mental health was taking such an extreme toll because we had isolation. Our students were experiencing a lack of social interaction, a lack of teamwork, because even when you're virtual and you try to incorporate teamwork, it's just not the same. There was this level of uncertainty. Oh my gosh, is the pandemic going to get worse? Is it going to get better? What are we doing?
Is it
That
ever
heightened
gonna end?
stress. Yeah, is it ever going to end?
Yeah.
I mean, I remember when we first got the notice that we were going to go under lockdown here in Michigan, our governor gave us about a 24-hour notice. So basically, everyone, it was the exact opposite of what we should have done. But because we had about a 24-hour notice, everyone was in the stores because they knew that after that 24 hours, they weren't going to be able to. So I remember we all just ran out to those stores, and I remember having conversations with the team and saying, hey, you know what? We're not going to change how we deliver services. At the time, we were doing everything in person. We did a little bit virtually, but mostly everything was in person. I was in the airport 5 times a month. And I remember having conversations saying, we're just going to wait this out. It'll only be a couple months. By the summer, we'll be back at it.
Yeah.
Well, that was in March. And in late April, mid May, somewhere around there, I said, hey, I don't know that this is going to ease up. Right.
Yeah.
And I knew that I needed to make sure not only that I kept the business going because of the impact we make, but I had team members that were expecting the paycheck to take care of their family. But we didn't know if it was going to end. We didn't know when it was going to end. We didn't know what was going to happen with contracts, with financial stability, instability. There were so many fears around safety and health, and it was just, it was so difficult. And that was just from noticing what was happening with our clients. But we also saw an extreme decrease in workplace morale because of the stress that was happening with everyone. Whether people were working virtually, there was a lot of stress because, as much as people say, oh my gosh, I would love to work remotely from home, if you haven't done it, that transition to it was rough.
Yeah.
I
I
mean, I don't know.
remember.
Did you ever experience that?
Yeah, I remember when lockdown hit in March. I was fairly new to corporate. I've only been in corporate for a couple of months, and in the beginning, the company I was working with for a couple of like 2 to 3 days didn't want to go remote. They still asked us to come into the office, but PPE wasn't available at the time. Like there weren't any masks. There was a high demand, so the supply wasn't available. So the company that I was working with had to fly in PPE from Australia so that we can uh, keep going to the office. And then other issues started to arise, like public transportation wasn't available anymore after the first few days. Like people had transportation, like I had a motorbike, other had cars, but it really wasn't safe anymore for anyone, for everyone. So
Yes.
they sent everyone home. It was exciting at the beginning. Just, you wake up and you don't have to do all that to go to work. You just have to sit up and go to your computer and start working. But then you really see it take a toll. I saw it with the team I worked with. Then I became a team leader like a couple of months after the lockdown, so into the height of the pandemic. And I like it was exciting at the beginning. Everyone was excited to just be home and not have to worry about anything. But then you see, one of the feedbacks that I heard a couple of years ago was how important social office interactions were to the morale of the team. So everyone just wanted to go back, but we can't. But that's when we really saw, like, when you're in the office before this happened, you don't really notice how important those small interactions are until you don't have them. But when I became a team leader, like I miss just chatting with the
Right.
next table. Like, so during those times, like everyone just wanted to be back, and it's also other conditions, right? There are people whose homes aren't really that conducive for work, like families and all that. So I do remember that time. And personally, during the height of the pandemic as well, so here in the Philippines, per family or per household, there's only one person who is allowed, like legally permitted to go out to the store and get things, all that. And it's usually the healthiest person. And for my family, that was me. And there's also anxiety of bringing COVID-19 back to my house because my parents are old. So if they get sick, who knows if they're gonna get better. And when we went back to the office, I got COVID from the office. So I was sent back home. So that's another thing, the anxiety of getting sick myself and getting everyone else around me sick.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah,
that
that
was
point
a
of
difficult time.
anxiety, that anxiety of bringing it back to your family, right? I mean, I my son and I were in one home and my parents were in their home, but I went back. I was the one doing all the grocery shopping, doing all of the work for both households because my parents were very ill and I'm not the healthiest, but my son was young at the time. I mean, he's still young, but so I was the person who was doing it all. And I remember being so scared. One of the reasons why I did not go back to do any in person client work was because I was so scared about my parents. And I
Mhm.
was so scared about getting them sick. And I remember it became to a point really unhealthy because I would find out that they went to get gas in their car or they went to do something and they didn't have a mask on or they didn't wear gloves. And I'm like, why am I doing all of this, like making sure I'm masking and gloved up? And why am I being so cautious if you're not even going to be cautious for yourself? And that was unhealthy because I became almost angry and resentful because I put my life on hold for so long and then realizing that the entire society had to put their life on hold. And even frontline workers who didn't put their life on hold, they were putting their life at risk. So it's either people were putting their life on hold or people were putting their life at risk across society. And that caused such a significant mental health component for all of us. And even though right now, I mean, I don't want to say COVID-19 is over, there's still people catching COVID, but it's so much less of a life altering moment if people do, right? We're not in the middle of a pandemic anymore. It's like a traditional flu now. But it's not like when it became a traditional flu that the mental health pandemic that we were struggling with as a society just went away because the long-term impact of the anxiety and depression that was caused and the financial impact that caused significant depression, there were people who lost so much of their livelihoods, business owners who couldn't get the extra funding to be able to maintain their teams. We were able to survive, and I'm very grateful for that. But we didn't get any government help. We didn't qualify for any of the loans. We didn't get any support. We were able to maintain because of being really frugal and really diligent with what we needed to do up until then. And then during the pandemic, how we as a team made sacrifices to say, all right, well, we don't want the business to go under. So we're going to do this, this, and this. But it's extremely difficult. And I think as a society, we need to have more conversations around mental health and realize that sometimes it's with the individual and sometimes it's outside influences, like with the pandemic, that can cause significant mental health crises.
Yeah, I remember my time as a team leader, like I mentioned, and uh, we really had to go to great lengths just to keep the team from, I don't know how else to say it, but from falling apart. And there's only so much you can do virtually, right, to keep the morale up. And I'm curious, what role can DI initiatives play in addressing mental health stigma and promoting inclusivity in both education and business environments as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I appreciate your stance of, we're doing everything we could, but it's difficult in the virtual environment, right? I think the number one piece is to make sure that companies and school systems are proactively providing policies and platforms to challenge bias that exist, being as proactive as possible, making sure that you are openly discussing any conversations that come up with empathy and understanding, realizing that all of us have different experiences and that all of us have different life situations that can impact who we are as individuals. But by organizations promoting that in both their policies and how they just operate in their regular culture and their climate within their environment, can create those safe spaces. And ultimately, safe spaces allow individuals to be validated and to be supported if they do need to seek help. We want to provide an environment within our organizations where everyone feels comfortable and validated being themselves and being authentically themselves. At the same time, no matter how proactive we are, people are still going to need to ask for help periodically. And as business owners, as leaders in the education space, not only do we need to be proactive, but we need to allow for people and provide an environment where people can step forward and say, hey, I'm still struggling, right? I know that you're doing this, this, and this. I know you're trying, and I'm still struggling. And we need to allow that opportunity for people to do that. It's crucial to integrate mental health awareness into everything we do and to make sure we're talking about it without the stigma, without the shame and the blame, so that we can remove that stigma and have those open conversations. Because as we say here at Us Squared, we know that guilt, shame, and blame are the glue that hold prejudice and stigma in place. So if we have those open conversations, then we can move forward with more open opportunities to eliminate that shame and blame and ultimately reduce the stigma that happens.
Yeah, that's very, very helpful. But as a leader, I guess in an individual level, what can someone do if they notice that someone or an employee is struggling with their mental health?
Yeah. And I appreciate this question because I genuinely believe that leaders want to provide an environment where everyone that works with them is supported. And also at the same time, as leaders, there's a lot of pressure to make sure that we meet our metrics, that we get everything done. And, sometimes it's a really difficult balance of how do you support someone with mental health concerns while also holding them accountable for what needs to be done. And I know myself as a business leader and as an educational leader, I have dealt with this on quite a few occasions. Number one is to help people realize that they are important and that you value them as an individual. Oftentimes as leaders, we focus so much on the metrics and on the accountability pieces that we forget that people are people. And it's important to remember that people are people. I often say to the team, I care about you as a person more than I care about you as an employee. And I genuinely mean that. Are there times where we have some difficult conversations? Absolutely. Are there times we probably need to have more difficult conversations? Absolutely. At the same time, I genuinely care about every single person on the team. And I want them to know that if they don't feel comfortable speaking to me about mental health concerns that they might have, I want them to have someone on the team that they can speak to. And I think that's critical as a leader, is to know and don't take it personally if someone doesn't want to talk to you. You're the leader, you're the boss. It's intimidating, right? There's so many components that go into that. It's not just the supervisory role, it's the power differential. But also, if you have people from different lived experiences, different cultures, different backgrounds, we all have different ways of approaching things. So it's not just about making sure that people feel comfortable talking to you as the leader. It's about making sure that the culture and the climate is one where everyone has at least one person they can go to if they are struggling with that, and providing a network of support. So my ideal situation is if someone on the team is struggling and they just need to take a day. We call them mental health days, but they just need to take a day. They just need to unplug for a moment. That they don't need to necessarily get permission from me, but if they have tasks that need to get done, maybe they reach out to another team member and say, hey, can you help me with this really quick? I need to get this done so that I can take a half day, or I need to get this done so I can take tomorrow off. And knowing that a team can support one another with that without the stigma, without feeling resentful, and also without anyone taking advantage of the situation, because I think that happens as well. And as leaders, we need to be realistic with that. There are significant mental health concerns that we need to address, and having mental health issues does not supersede the opportunity to hold people accountable. They do not need to operate in the same vacuum. It's important for us to hold people accountable and support them during any mental health struggles they're having.
Yeah, that's one thing that I really appreciate with our team. Actually, like myself, I can't speak for the entire team, but myself being open with you and other members of our team as and I've definitely taken mental health days, not just day
We all have,
days.
Justin.
Yeah, and I really really appreciate having that opportunity, having that um just having that available to me for days like that. So that's really important, and I think that's also part of the reason why I choose to be part of the team is that how open we are with each other, and not just about our mental health but other things as well. So,
Yeah.
and you've also mentioned a while ago about things that organizations can do, but do you have any like concrete proactive measures that you can suggest?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we talk about as a leader, if you notice, that was a lot of the reactive, right? You notice someone's struggling. You notice that something's happening. How can you address that? Proactively, organizations, whether they're educational institutions or businesses, can absolutely provide a range of strategies. And depending on the budget, depending on what their timeline looks like, what we have seen work really well is offering mental health training for their staff so that everyone understands, right? It's some of those microaggressions that we use on a regular basis that we don't realize how hard they can be. I know some of the ones that really stick out to me are when people say, wow, that's crazy, right? Again, it seems totally innocuous. It seems like, well, so everyone uses it, it's fine. But just the word crazy is such a negative connotation, right? And another one that we use a lot or we hear people say is, oh, I'm so OCD. I just need to have it like this. But they don't actually have the diagnosis of OCD, right? So they're trivializing or invalidating the severity of a diagnosis of OCD. So by offering mental health training, helping people realize how maybe innocuous, what might seem as totally mundane comments can actually be really hurtful. That training piece can be super helpful. Even if it's just an article that you read together as a staff and talk about at a leadership meeting. Providing access to counseling services. A lot of companies, especially corporate, and we've seen it in education as well, have EAPs or employee assistance programs. And some of those EAPs or employee assistance programs are actually counseling services. I was talking to one of our team members who is a consultant who has another full-time job. They do this work to feed what they say is they do this work to feed their soul, and they do the other work to feed their family, right? Because we operate as a nonprofit. We're not here to make tons of money. We're here to make tons of impact. But they were talking about how it is an app that they feel is the best support they have ever received. They've gone to in-person therapy. They've gone to a residential treatment program. They've gone to a variety of different programs to support with their mental health. But an app that their company right now is offering is by far, according to them, the best support they've ever had. Now, I reached out and figured out what the pricing is. It's less than $1 per month per employee for this program. So when we talk to companies and we say, oh, you need to do this, and the response is, we don't have the money for that. We can't afford it. When there's programs like this that can truly help, right? Us Squared has programs specifically to offer that support network, not just around mental health, but for all of the employees to be able to have a place to ask questions. But doing that, there are resources out there that are either free or very cost effective. Making sure that you're promoting self care, that you're not stigmatizing the idea of a mental health day, right? Oftentimes we'll say, oh, you get personal time or you get sick time. But with sick time, some companies are still requiring the need for a doctor's note, or it
Yeah.
has to be a physical ailment to use sick time. Why is that necessary, right? As a company, if we can say that psychological, emotional, mental, physical well-being are all important, they're all valid, and they're all able to be used, your time is your time to use how you need to use it. Creating affinity groups. So we've talked about employee resource groups. Employee resource groups are groups that are meant to help people understand, right? So an employee resource group might be the group who creates the training or provides the training for other staff members to understand mental health. But an affinity group is a support network of people who all self-identify within that identity. So you could do an affinity group for people who struggle with mental health issues. That offers an opportunity for people to know that they're surrounded by others who understand what they're struggling with because they too have the same either diagnosis or self-identifier. So offering that opportunity for peers to meet one another and to share those experiences can also be really helpful. And oftentimes that's free as well. It might take some time to say, okay, I'm going to let you leave your desk for 45 minutes a month so you can have time to meet with your affinity group. Or maybe you don't even do that. Maybe it's just people get together after work one day to go have dinner together. Or maybe on their lunch break, they all sit together. So there are opportunities for people to do that. And I think it's critical for leaders, companies, educational systems to look at their policies and to think about how they can proactively as well as reactively support mental health to provide that meaningful support. Providing that accommodation, making sure there's regular check-ins, making sure that people are genuinely seen, heard, welcomed, and valued.
Yeah, and I think it's also important on an individual level as members of these organizations to just research what resources are available to you. Like maybe they are not announced, but they are available. It's okay to ask, and it's okay to look for these resources and ask for support when you need them. And no one should navigate these challenges alone, and that's really important.
Yeah, and as you talk about that, I think it's also important for people who are in an organization, employees, to know that even if you don't know that an opportunity exists for you, that if you ask either your leader or maybe someone in the HR department, depends on how big your company is, that oftentimes there are resources available. We just don't do as good of a job as we could to make sure that that's public knowledge. I know for myself, when I was in the school systems, there were so many resources available to everyone who worked in our school system. And as the superintendent, when I was the assistant superintendent, when I was a principal, I never knew all of the resources that were available. I often had the little cheat sheet next to me and I would look at it because someone would come in and say, oh, I need help with this. I didn't know offhand if we had it because there were so many resources available. So I think it's important for us to, again, like you said, not just know of those resources, but also be willing to ask if we don't know, because there probably is something available for us.
Mm-hmm. That's thank you. That's a lot of very helpful information. But I think on the other end of the spectrum, I also wonder for individuals who are struggling or experience sanism in the workplace, what do you recommend?
Yeah. First and foremost, we have to talk about it, right? The first thing to be able to address any discrimination, prejudice, or stigma that's attached is to eliminate that stigma by humanizing the conversation. We talk a lot about humanizing bias. We all have biases. Mental health is not immune to that. We all have biases around mental health. We all have a certain impression of what that looks like, what that means. And specifically around mental health, we have to talk about it. We have to share our own personal experiences, both positive and negative, because we are not alone in this. And mental health, just like any identity, but specifically within mental health, it is important to make sure that we all know we're not alone. Isolation can tremendously hinder mental health concerns, and it can exponentially negatively impact what we do as a society if we don't have those conversations. When we feel isolated or we feel like we're the only ones struggling with that, it makes it so much more difficult. I would also encourage individuals to look for support groups, even if it's not within your organization or your business. I remember myself after having my son, I was in a support group. And many of the parents there were dealing with postpartum depression, which is a part of Sanism. I did not struggle with postpartum, but it was a single mothers group, and I was struggling with, how do I balance a really, really intense job? I was an assistant superintendent when I first had my son, being a single parent, not having any family nearby. I was 6 hours away from any of my family, and I was raising a child on my own with a very intense job. And that struggled with mental health, the anxiety of maybe messing something up. As parents, we worry so much about, what if I mess up my child's life? What if I make a mistake? My son was only 4 pounds when he was born. He was 7 weeks early. I was so nervous that something was going to go wrong that I had a support group. And I remember dealing with some of that, having some of those conversations. There was stigma even there. And I think it's important for all of us to just have those conversations. Ask if there's support systems around you, and if there's not, look them up. We're in a day and age right now where Google is so available to so many of us, if not all of us. Googling, where can I get help? I'm struggling with mental health. What can I do? There's 800 numbers to call. There's resources. There's online opportunities. But just being willing to ask that question and humanizing the conversation. Because if we can overcome the shame within ourselves, then we are much more likely to overcome the blame and the guilt that we interpret onto others.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Megan. And thank you so much for yet again another very meaningful conversation that we had today. That's really all the time that we have. But for anyone who's listening, I just want you to know you are not alone. There, you have your community and people out there that you can reach out to. And I know someone is always there. Someone out there is willing to help out. And don't be afraid to ask questions. And if you have questions that you would like Megan or I or someone else on our team to answer, drop a comment in the comment section, or you can also email us at info@us2consulting.com.
Love that, Justin. And just a reminder for the podcast, you can find it on Spotify and YouTube. And we look forward to hearing from you all. And we hope that you'll join us next time as we continue some more meaningful conversations that can inspire change within our communities and beyond, ultimately fostering a future where everyone is seen, heard, welcomed, and valued. In the words of Justin, you are not alone. And thank you for making sure that we are not alone today.